Good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for the invitation to speak and for you, the audience, for taking the time out on a Saturday morning. Now, we live in interesting times, a much used analogy in the current epoch, but the current events of our times are raising all sorts of challenges that are leading to no real solutions. Neoliberal capitalism, the dominant force within the global north, is driving people apart, and widening inequalities is the norm everywhere, as what is left of the welfare state is clawed back further still. A so-called free market economic adventure that was reinvigorated by the machinations of a political elite looking to sell off the family silver, where there is no such thing as society, has led to a hugely unequal set of conditions and relations that continue to amplify. Britain's economic system has been taken over by oligarchs with vested political interests. It is difficult to break down as it is self-selecting and resistant to outside pressure. Workers are completely locked out of the capital accumulation process. The media is biased and our politics is broken. There is a loss of the imagination on all matters of race, identity, and politics. But resistance is not futile. Far from it. We are seeing ordinary people become wiser to the psychopolitics of big technology. We are witnessing a youth mobilization in relation to climate change, decolonization of the curriculum, and an attitude towards diversity that is largely encouraging. But the battle rages on. Indeed, there are numerous challenges facing Britain as it grapples with issues of diversity, belonging, and mobility, especially when it is apparent that the pernicious forces of racism and racialization continue to affect the nature of the lived experience in Britain more widely. These concerns are especially pointed when it comes to discussing the experiences of British Muslim minorities, now numbering over 3 million and making up 5% of the population, and where over 90% of British Muslims live in England, with London containing 2/3 of all Muslims in Britain. These Muslims effectively make up over 1/3 of all ethnic and racial minorities. 1 in 4 of Britain's minorities are South Asian Muslims. And these groups are the focus of much of the gaze of media and political actors interested in questions of cultural relativism, grooming, racialization, extremism, and political violence. This disproportional attention, however, takes attention away from the needs and wants of minorities as a whole, concentrating on the negative traits relating to the experiences of the few who fall down the fissures created by the wider workings of society. Post-war migration processes have led to around 2 million Bangladeshis, Indians, and Pakistanis, with half under the age of 25 and 1 in 3 under the age of 15. These demographics represent particular challenges in relation to participation and engagement. But these issues reflect also on the failures of integration and diversity policy, combined with downward pressures on social mobility. It exposes the failure of government policy, leading to the inability of Muslim communities to plan, invest, and deliver in relation to the Islamic cultural and civic education and development needs of the younger generations. While this is not the norm by any stretch, the margins of these spaces reveal acute contestations in relation to being, becoming, and belonging. And in this milieu, there are genuine issues of identity which have implications for citizenship. And there are, of course, also wider concerns relating to gender that one needs to consider too, including what it means for questions of masculinity and femininity, which are expressed culturally, theologically, and politically. And how Muslim groups interpret and imply Islam is also crucial to understand, with instances of both progressive and regressive readings of the faith, leading to risks in relation to extremism, radicalization, and political violence. But because of these specifically localized problems in relation to the apparent unassimilability of Muslims in parts of towns and cities across the country, where these rough edges in relation to Muslimness are regarded as not merely a blot on the landscape, but as a potential danger to the rest of society, Islamophobia grows. It does so exponentially, given the wider problems of growing economic inequality, political division, and social conflict that affect us all in an age of anger due to a distrust of the political classes and a fear of the other exploited by the very same demagogues aiming to capitalize on the discord for political gain. All, however, are woefully ignorant of history. but their frustrations know no bounds due to the lack of any clear vision or direction on the way forward except to retreat into exceptionalism, nativism, and populism. These consequences, the consequences of structural, institutional, and cultural Islamophobia for some push people inwards, leading to cultural withdrawal. And in some cases, it leads to a few to reject society and the religio-cultural norms of their parents in pursuit of political resistance based on their own notions of purity or utopianism, some of which leads to paths of extremism and ultimately political violence. And in these complex, multi-layered realms, violence is seen as a solution to historical, immediate, and future predicaments created by enmity towards Islam. And thus, the circle is complete. At the fringes of all aspects of society, Islamophobia causes radicalization, and vice versa. The education system in Britain is unable to prepare young people for a diverse, interdependent, mutually enhancing globe in which we all have a stake. Rather, it continues to divide along class and ethnic lines. The likes of the far right also play on the dread of Islam, not Muslims, such is the simplistic, unenlightened worldview that they have come to appreciate. They feed into and draw sustenance from this Islamophobia, radicalized to the extent of not merely delegitimizing specific Muslim practices, but the idea of Islam itself. This creates further tensions as it, by design, engulfs all Muslims, leading to retreat for some who might have ordinarily worked towards balancing Muslim life with the secular existence in a liberal democracy. The menacing effects of Islamophobia reflect on wide-ranging aspects of racism, which has the consequence of pushing many more Muslims from all walks of life to radicalize, although ordinarily still struggling over their Muslimness. Sadly, we also have to come to terms with the reality that there are forms of cumulative radicalization. We have to come to terms with the fact that in the case of the Christchurch terror attack, the primary suspect is a self-identified white supremacist who viewed the world in Manichean terms, regarding Islam and Muslims as a single movement and its people who are not merely a blot on the landscape, but deserve to be depopulated. This is because they somehow present a risk to the survival of the white nation. But of course here, there is no perspective on the nature of this whiteness, that is, its own internal diversity, or the historical legacies of class formation, colonialism, Orientalism, eugenicism, or white nationalism that have defined the space occupied by whiteness. But this perspective is also an odd combination. There is a palpable fear presented in relation to the other, whose motivations are to take over through population expansion. But at the same time, there's a decrying of these others for their primitive, backward, and hateful natures, thus legitimizing ethnic nationalism and white supremacism. Some regard this as a reality of Islamophobia. They would be accurate in this instance. Islamophobia is not merely a response to a sense of cultural dilution at the hands of some regressive other. It extends into notion of ethnic cleansing of these groups. And there is much to expand on the nature of the motivations of white supremacist suspects who attack worshippers in mosques and synagogues, which align with the activities of other individual actors apparently acting on their own. The idea of the lone wolf terrorist is a complete misnomer. All have carried out acts of ultraviolence in the name of defending against the loss of privileges associated with whiteness at one level, but also the fear of being overtaken by hordes of primitives. These kinds of ideas have motivated far-right extremists in the last few years in a number of places in the global north, including in Norway, Canada, England, and now in New Zealand. These reasons for these are structural, cultural, and political. Over the last 2 decades in particular, men have faced considerable challenges to their positions in society, especially in the labor market and in educational terms. This is the result of improving positions for women in these settings, but also because globalization means that the average young white man has to compete far harder than ever before, and where his privileged urban post-industrial patriarchy can no longer be sustained in the light of an increasingly interdependent world. The rage against the loss of supremacy results in the venting of a certain fury against significant others. There was a time, well before the events of 9/11, where multiculturalism and diversity were seen as assets that contributed to the well-being of nations, where differences among people resulted in an enriched, lived reality that benefits all in the pursuit of human values. But multiculturalism became distorted when the political and media classes began to shift attention away from these notions as they associated the concept with the risk of polarization, radicalization, and ultimately terrorism. Multiculturalism or diversity has been completely securitized in the current space. And it's not beyond the realm of many who have had a classical education, let's put it that way, to think that too much diversity can lead to the fragmentation of the nation itself. Alas, the political experiment with diversity was over before it began, which has led to further polarization and entrenchment in various physical concentrations within urban spaces. And in the wider context of growing Islamophobia across the world today, these anti-Islam and anti-Muslim voices grow louder at a time when politicians in Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Poland evoke populist sentiment. This is especially the case as many of these countries were directly affected by the Syrian refugee crisis that began in 2015, which saw over 500,000 people walking through the Balkans on their way to countries like Germany. Taken as a whole, the extreme far right in Europe focused on the historical dynamics of Ottoman history and Christian Europe. For example, Andres Breivik made clear links, seeing himself as a Knight Templar, saving Christianity from the invasive Muslim other. These notions appeal to young men who are at the fringes of their societies, burying themselves in the discourse of the far and the radical right online, with its focus on hate towards differences, women, and groups of different sexual preferences or leanings. All of it supports the projected inherited importance of the average white male who has to club together with greater cause in order to A, save the white nation from invasion through immigration and mixing, and B, to eliminate other undesirables as they are breeding at excessive rates, and unless checked, they will fully absorb the white nation. So I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity again to speak about these concepts, and I hope some of these ideas around how we think about diversity, multiculturalism, in the context of a society and an economy that's leading to polarizations and divisions, is creating more challenges than opportunities. And we are in a very interesting period in history in regards to these acute challenges in this present moment. And without obvious solutions, the idea of retreat has become the dominant narrative among the elites, but also among groups whose idea of identity politics has also been placed under pressure. So I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your thoughts and comments.